Hello and welcome to Trojan Talk. I'm your host, Aaron Taylor. With me today is Dr. Stephen Taylor, Political Science Department here at Troy University, here to talk about the census. And I want to thank you for joining me here today to kind of give folks an idea of the census and why it's important.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
And the census, we're going to get some details about why Alabama is a particularly sensitive spot for the census this year. But for the background for people, especially some of the younger folks who have not dealt with the census before, tell us a little about census and the background and history and why it happened.
So the census is a constitutionally mandated action that has to take place every 10 years. It's in Article 1 of the Constitution. It was originally designed for both representation and for taxation. Before we had the income tax in the early 20th century, states paid taxes also based on the number of persons in the state. But it also, and the reason we do it now is specifically for representation and apportionment to each state as to how many members of Congress, the House of Representatives specifically, that each state would receive. Each state receives one by default, and the rest are allocated based on population. It also has other effects in regards to certain kinds of federal policies that are often dictated based on population. So it matters for any number of other policies the federal government might have to allocate in regards to education or to disaster relief or various other issues as well. So the number matters for a variety of reasons.
And the process that now earlier this year, April 1st was the quote unquote census day,
Right.
but the census is an all year thing, and it goes to some, I think like October is when they start.
They'll continue
all the way
collect.
through. So there's still an opportunity, even though folks are out there like, well, I heard the day already passed. There's still an opportunity that they've got a while to respond to the census.
Yes, in fact, what's going to happen is if you don't answer the form, they're going to send people out to ask you. Because again, this is not just something that got cooked up in recent years. This is specifically mandated by the Constitution that every single person in the United States be counted and accounted for. So they will actually send out hordes of people with clipboards, or maybe they're electronic these days, I don't know, and take this information if they possibly can. So yes, there's still the opportunity to provide the information to the federal government.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing about clipboards or whatever, because the last time was 10 years ago, and there's been a complete technological paradigm shift since the last time they did this. I mean, because doing it online 10 years ago would have been absurd.
No, I don't recall specifically, but I don't think there was an online option 10 years ago. And in fact, I did mine online. It was remarkably easy to do.
And that's one of those things is now that there is that accessibility, the online accessibility, there shouldn't be much of an excuse, you would think, for folks to take advantage of this.
Well, I mean, of course, it's also, you can do it by mail, but the bottom line remains that still there are a lot of folks that don't have internet access and so therefore can't answer online. And I suppose in less fraught times you could go to the library and do it, but the libraries have been closed down in many cases. So it's created more complexity, no doubt, and the COVID-19 situation will have affected the census count or the ability to get the data, including even the sending out of the physical counters.
Well, and when they're counting, what are they looking for? What are they counting? Who are they counting?
Everybody.
So, yeah.
And one thing that's important to understand that they're not counting citizens, they're counting residents. So every man, woman, and child in the United States is supposed to be counted. They do collect other data, such as racial data, marital status. I think there's a question about home ownership if memory serves. There's some longer forms they also use. Some people get longer forms to collect further statistical data for use and analysis, but that's not part of they don't ask everyone those questions. But the way we understand, this is the main way by which we understand the demographics of the United States.
And one of the big situations this year, obviously, in years past it has been, but I've seen more focus on it this year, and Alabama is being affected by this, and that is population shifts, and because of that, representation in Congress is affected. And Alabama is one of those states that potentially is on the chopping block due to the census numbers.
Right. So the number of members of the House of Representatives is set by law at 435 seats. It's been set that way since the early 20th century, when actually we had less than 100,000 residents in the United States. So now we have well over 300 million residents, and nonetheless we've not increased the size of the House. It's important to point out, because most people don't realize this, the number of seats in the House is not set by the Constitution, it's set by law. And one could argue, and in fact, since my area of expertise is democratic representation, I would argue that the House is too small for our population. Although getting support for more politicians is difficult to accrue. But the bottom line is, right, and I forget the exact number off the top of my head, but currently, right now, pre-new census, each member of the House probably represents somewhere around 750,000 persons. So the degree to which you have direct contact, or access, I should say, to your member of the House is quite limited. And that number will simply grow because since the 435 number is set in stone, what we're looking at here is not just about population growth, but where populations grow. In Alabama, for example, it is the case that the population will have grown since the last census. But the question becomes, will it have grown at a relative rate versus other states? So states like Texas have continued to grow at a much higher rate. And there are other states that have grown likewise. So you've got the 435, you allocate 50 to begin with, because every state gets one. So then you take the rest and you allocate based on the formula based on population. So some states will lose seats in the House by definition. And it is likely that Alabama will lose one seat, which will also mean we'll lose an electoral vote in the election, not this coming election, but in subsequent elections.
Following. And so, and that affects on a large scale in the fact that representation is gone, but then also that's one less person working for the state and the national government.
Sure. I mean, just from a basic point of view, the less representation you have, the less influence you have in Congress. So the ability of Alabamians to influence federal policy will, by definition, be diminished. And I think, again, I'll come back to the point that I made. I think it's important to recognize that because the seats are fixed, that by definition, over time, you're diluting the influence of each individual member of the House.
Well, here's hoping that folks take a little bit from this discussion and go out and fill out the census form if they haven't done it already. And I want to thank you for joining us to shed a little light on the importance of the census and how it's going to affect Alabamians and maybe some other people across the country. Thanks for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on today's edition of Trojan Talk.